Good evening and welcome to Mining the Riches of the Parsha. I have missed you over the last 2 weeks and I am thrilled to be back with you and look forward to continuing tonight and future Thursday nights. Jerusalem is a port city on the shore of eternity. She is always arriving, always sailing away. These lines from a poem by Yehuda Amichai are at the entrance to the newly reopened exhibit space at Migdal David, the Tower of David, just inside the old city of Jerusalem, beside Shar Yafo, the Jaffa Gate. I urge you to visit this new iteration of a momentous site on your next visit. The exhibit tells the story of Jerusalem in creative ways, and Amichai's poem sets the tone right at the beginning, and it also sets the mood for our learning tonight. Jerusalem is a port city on the shore of eternity. She is always arriving, always sailing away. Today is the 17th day of Tammuz on the Jewish calendar, and we turn our attention to Jerusalem. What we had, what we lost. What we have, what we do not yet have. What we miss, and what we mourn. This day, the 17th of Tammuz, begins a period of 3 weeks that culminates in Tisha B'av, the 9th of Av, that commemorates the destruction of the first temple, the second temple, and many other catastrophic events in our history. But as for this day, the 17th of Tammuz, the reason for designating this as a fast day, as a day of mourning, the Talmud tells us that there are 5 reasons, 5 different events that occurred on this day for which it is turned into a day of mourning. So I want to ask you a question. I want to share with you the passage in the Talmud that lists these 5 catastrophes. And I want you to think to yourself as you're listening to it, in your opinion, which is the worst event? Which is the most catastrophic event of these 5? Think about that and we're going to discuss it. The Talmud says, excuse me, Chamisha dvarim iru es avoseinu b'shivasa b'Tammuz. There were 5 terrible things that happened over the course of many years on this date, the 17th of Tammuz. Number 1, Nishtabru haluchos. This is the day that Moshe broke the luchos. This is the day that Moshe came down with the first set of tablets at the end of the first 40 days after Sinai. And the Jewish people had built the golden calf. The Jewish people were not ready to receive God's law, and Moshe smashed the Aseres Adibros, the tablets with the 10 Commandments engraved on them. That's number 1 event that occurred on the 17th of Tammuz. Number 2, Ubatel HaTamid. The Tamid offering was discontinued. In this week's Torah portion, the Parsha Pinchas, the Torah tells us about all the sacrifices. And one of the sacrifices was a carbon tamid, a continual offering, a daily offering. An offering, a sacrifice that was offered in the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, every single morning and every single afternoon, continuous, permanent, every day, no deviation. That was the carbon tamid, and that was discontinued. It was discontinued when the Babylonians laid siege around Jerusalem just before the destruction of the temple, and because of the fighting, they were no longer able to offer this daily offering. Number 3, v'huvka ha'ir, the walls of the city were pierced. Remember, there was a siege around Jerusalem. It lasted a long time, until finally on the 17th of Tammuz, the walls of the city were pierced. That led to hand-to-hand combat for a period of 3 weeks, at the end of which Tisha B'av, the 9th of Av, the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. But the walls of the city, the beginning of the end militarily, was the 17th of Tammuz. Number 4, the fourth event that happened, the Saraf Apostomos Esatorah. This happened later, during the Second Temple period, during the time when the Assyrian Greeks were powerful. This is what leads up to the Hanukkah story. There was a leader, an Assyrian Greek leader, Apostamos, and he burned the Torah scroll. Not just, as terrible as it would be to burn any Torah scroll, but this was the Torah scroll that had been kept in the temple, that was used as the source to check every other Torah scroll from it. This was the one that we knew that was correct, the model, the template. It was destroyed on this date. And number 5, vehemid tselem behechel, an idol was erected on the temple grounds, in the courtyard of the temple. An idol, the absolute opposite of everything the Beis HaMikdash stands for, the worship of God stands for, one God, and an idol was erected there. 5 terrible events at different periods that occurred on this day. So I ask you this question: which of the 5 was the worst? Well, I think probably each of us might have our own opinion. But listen, please, carefully to the opinion of Rabbi Aaron Soloveitchik, because his opinion, I believe, is somewhat surprising. I do not think many of us would have intuited that this is the most serious of all 5, and yet listen to what Rabbi Aaron Soloveitchik says. Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein, I apologize. Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein. Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein points out a fundamental distinction between different religious approaches, different religions. There are other major religions, and there's our major religion. And one of the fundamental distinctions is that often in other religions, the approach of that religion is that daily practices are secondary. And they emphasize special occasions, the holiday, the annual gathering, the special event. And Rav Aaron Lichtenstein says, in general, this follows human nature. People are attracted to that which is festive, special, and exceptional. They disdain that which is routine and boring and everyday. And that describes the priority of many other religions. But Rav Aaron said, Judaism is based on tamid, continual, daily. I've shared with some of you before the insight of Rabbi Yehuda Amital. You know, there's a famous passage of our rabbis where the rabbis say, Zeh klal gadol b'Torah. This is the fundamental principle of the entire Torah. The entire Torah can be boiled down to this. The most famous such statement is the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. Amar Rabbi Akiva, v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Love your fellow as you love yourself. Zeh klal gadol b'Torah. This is it. Everything else boils down to this, and everything else flows from this. That's the klal gadol, the major fundamental principle. That's the famous statement that we're familiar with. But in fact, among the writings of our rabbis, there are other opinions. Another opinion has a different verse. Vayivra Elokim es ha'adam b'tzalmo. B'tzelem Elokim bara oso. God created human beings, men and women, in the image of God. That is a klal gadol b'Torah. The fact that every single human being is connected to God, is beloved by God, is cherished to God, is somehow, and we don't necessarily understand how this works, but somehow connected to God, this intrinsic value and worth and connection to God, this is a klal gadol. This is the way that we look at each other. This is the basis of how we treat each other. That we are all created b'tzelem Elokim. And then there is a third opinion. And the third opinion quotes a pasuk, a verse in our Torah portion, the Parsha of Pinchas, where the Torah is describing the korbanos, the sacrifices in the Beis Hamikdash. The Torah says, one sacrifice you should offer every single morning, and a second sacrifice you should offer every single afternoon. That's called the Karban Tamid, the daily offering, the continual offering. And Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein explains because Judaism wants us to relate to God not only on special occasions, but at every time, in every moment, at every place. I've shared with you before, the name, the word that we use for Jewish law is halacha, but halacha means walking, going, and it implies doing what God wants us to do as we walk through life. Every step of our walk through life, every moment, every place, every situation. The words of the Shema, the famous prayer, are instructive for us. The Torah says, "V'dibarta bam." You should be engaged in the words of Torah and studying the Torah and in practicing the Torah. When? Not just on the high holidays, not just on special occasions. B'shivtecha b'veisecha, when you're sitting at home. U'v'lechtecha b'derech, and when you're walking outside. B'shachbacha, when you're about to go to sleep. U'v'kumecha, and when you wake up. Every moment, every place. Our lives should accompany our connection to God at every moment. There's a fascinating technical detail of Jewish law. Tadir, ushe'ena tadir, tadir kodim. Means like this. Let's say you have two mitzvos to perform, but you got to do one first and one second. So which comes first? Which takes priority? If you have a situation where there's one mitzvah which is tadir, frequent, it's a mitzvah you do more frequently, and a second mitzvah which is eino tadir, it's not so frequent, it's not so common. Now, you have to do both of them. The question is which takes priority, which comes first? Tadir, ushe'eino tadir, tadir kodim. The one that is more frequent comes first, because the one that is more frequent has more value, more importance, because we're not looking for the great occasions, the high moments. We're looking for the everyday routine of how we connect with God as we walk through life. The Talmud even goes further and says, Tadir Makudish. What if you have two mitzvos? One is frequent, the other is not as frequent, but it's more holy. It's more holy than the other. Says the Talmud, Tadir Kodim. The one that is more frequent still comes first. Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein explains that Judaism cannot survive without daily routine. It does not work. And we see this all around us. Judaism cannot be meaningful and cannot be passed down generation to generation in a meaningful way unless it is observed on an ongoing basis. If we're going to rely on the once a year highlight, on the milestone of life, those are beautiful. But that's not going to keep Judaism alive within ourselves and within our families. It just won't. And so therefore, Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein explains, when the Tamid was stopped, because the temple was about to be destroyed, we've studied this before, prayer had to take over the role of Tamid. So instead of the sacrifices being offered every single day, we have prayers that we offer every single day that correspond to those sacrifices, because we can't live as Jews without Tamid, without daily, routine, service of God, connection to God. It cannot exist. And that's why, according to Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein, the loss of the Tamid was the most serious of the 5 tragedies that occurred on this day. Today we have a greater danger. Many Jews identify with an alien, foreign worldview that only special moments are important. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, a bar mitzvah, a wedding, God forbid a funeral. So many Jews, this is where they plug in. This is where they connect. And for so many of these Jews, routine daily prayer and study is of little value. Now, of course, every mitzvah is a mitzvah, and we want to hold on to every Jew, no matter how strong or not so strong their connection is. We are all to be cherished and to be encouraged. But we have to understand that we must push back against that ideology. We have to emphasize the value of being in contact with God on an ongoing basis at every moment. We must appreciate the holiness of moral routine daily life. And so it's necessary for us to reclaim the spirituality of the routine of prayer, the routine of Torah study. It's necessary to remain true to the essential nature of Judaism, the importance of Tamid in Jewish life. And Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein concludes, to counter the cessation of the Tamid on the 17th of Tammuz, if today is the day that marks that we lost this element of Tamid, it is up to us specifically during this month to renew and strengthen this aspect of our service to God. The responsibility rests with each of us to act, to start the momentum towards renewing our ancient glory, to try living and bringing back that which was so tragically lost on this day so many years ago. I want to share with you a piece that is based partially on an essay by Yossi Klein Halevi. Today, of course, the 17th of Tammuz, we begin this period of the 3 weeks, the period of mourning for Jerusalem and for the Beis Hamikdash that culminates with Tisha B'av, the 9th of Av. Now, there is a difference, and I have seen this very clearly. There's a difference between the experience of these 3 weeks in Israel and for those of us who are outside of Israel. In Israel, this 3-week period is problematic, especially for younger people, because look at the Jewish reality today. How is it possible that we're going to spend 3 weeks and then a day of Tisha B'av sitting on the ground and crying and mourning the destruction of Jerusalem, and it's desolate and it's empty and there's nothing here and we're all gone and there are no people and there are no spirituality here, there's no community here? How do we do that in the face of the reality that we're looking around. There are millions of people, and there are lots of buildings, and the streets are crowded. And as many people as there are sitting on the floor and crying in front of the kotel on Tisha B'av night, there are just as many young people standing a little further back socializing. It's a vibrant community, perhaps one of the most vibrant in the world today. And it's within the context of a state of Israel. We are guarded by Israeli soldiers. We're protected. We can defend ourselves. How do we connect to the classic tragedy of Tisha B'av? And for us here, the question is even stronger. How do we mourn what we never had? How do we mourn what we have never experienced, what we don't even know what it looks like? And it's thousands of years ago. How can we possibly mourn that? So, first of all, let me suggest that the difference in the emphasis between Jews outside of Israel and inside of Israel, both of those points of view are true, and they need to be addressed. And they need to be addressed in individual ways. But concerning both of them, Yossi Klein Halevi suggests that perhaps the appropriate response is not mourning as much as sobriety. In other words, a heightened awareness of our collective failures. The rabbis famously tell us that the Second Temple was destroyed because of sinas chinam, needless hatred. And what that means is our failure to function as a people that appreciates diversity, our failure to function as a people that can manage its disagreements with mutual respect for each other. He writes, the basis for an individual's spiritual life is humility, awareness that we are transient beings whose understanding of the world is at best incomplete. The same insight is the basis for a healthy national life. No part of the Jewish people can claim to be sole heir of Jewish history. Those who believe that their community is the only repository of Jewish wisdom and that other communities are empty vessels with little to contribute to our growth risk a spiritually fatal arrogance. Sadly, that arrogance surrounds us and threatens to drown us today. I discussed this morning. We see this all around us, all too often in our own families, in our community, and today most dramatically, we have a real problem with this in Israel. And just to take the example that I mentioned this morning, and today's news is even more frightening than it was this morning. The controversy taking place in Israel today over judicial reform. I shared earlier that every single person I spoke to during our 2 weeks in Israel had a strong opinion about this issue. Nobody was neutral. And I spoke with people on all sides of this controversy. And while the different people I spoke to differed bitterly in what their opinion was, they all agreed on one principle. Everyone I spoke to agreed that this debate will determine the fate of Israel. And several people told me, and these are people who are not given to exaggeration, people who are thoughtful people. Several people told me that from their point of view, this controversy is splitting apart Israeli society, and they fear, seriously, without exaggeration, they fear, God forbid, civil war. And I must tell you, having been in Israel, it's frightening. Yes, we do hear voices of moderation and compromise from across the political spectrum. And I pray that they will ultimately prevail. But the extremists on both sides are becoming only more extreme. They are ratcheting up the hysteria of their rhetoric, demonizing each other, using more and more dehumanizing language about each other. And even, it pains me to say, in the news today, acts of violence against each other. And it's frightening. So Halevi makes a practical suggestion. A practical suggestion of what should be our avodah shebelev, our inner heart's work during these next 3 weeks. A practical suggestion would be for every single one of us to consider the community, the group, the ideology that I most oppose, that I most resent, and to contemplate the positive Jewish values that are embodied within them. If you feel that the settlers are wrong, think about the immense love they have for the land of Israel. If you feel that the leftists are wrong, think about the tremendous love of peace that they have. For every group with which we disagree, think about their highest motives. Allow yourself to feel a measure of gratitude toward ideological opponents who are trying in their way to be worthy of the Jewish story. The 3 weeks are an opportunity to pause in our communal bickering, our endless arguments over morality and survival and tradition and innovation. And we need to ask ourselves, is this the Jewish people we want to be? And I hope, looking around us today, we answer no. This is not what we want. We want better. We want calmer. We want more respectful, more civil than what we see around us today. Yossi Klein Halevi concludes with this line, a great line. Enough mourning for the sake of mourning. Let us turn the 3 weeks into a time of Jewish healing. And I would add, we need it today more than ever before. Considering the inner work we need to be engaged in, starting today during these 3 weeks, let's move to the level of the individual, and from there to the communal and the national level. I want to share with you a story I heard from Rabbi Meilech Biderman. But I want to point out the story does not end where you might expect it to end. The story is about a man named Reb Zelig Braverman, or Braverman. He was one of the respected Jews of old Jerusalem. He has since passed away. And Reb Zelig had a practice, he and his family, every Friday, he and his family would bake challahs, many, many, many challahs, and he would distribute them to the poor in his neighborhood in honor of Shabbos. And he had his regular group of recipients that he would give challah to. There was one man, he was very poor. He was broken in body and spirit. Sometimes he worked as a manual labor, often he found no work. But still he worked hard all week for very, very little pay, and late one Friday afternoon he knocked on Reb Zelig's door and requested his 2 challahs. He was a regular. Reb Zelig said to him, "But today you came so late. There are no challahs left. I already distributed all the challahs." This man said to Reb Zelig, "I need 2 challahs for Shabbos." And Reb Zelig said to him, "Listen, my friend, listen, if there's no challahs, there's no challahs. I don't have anything to give you." And then this man lost his temper. And he said, "Zelig, I need 2 challahs." And he slapped Reb Zelig across the face 2 times. So right away, Reb Zelig went to his own Shabbos table, took his own 2 challahs, and gave them to this poor man. And the man left. Now, Reb Zelig's children were watching this. They were in the room. And they asked their father, "Should you really have rewarded that kind of behavior? I mean, he slapped you. It's not acceptable. Under any circumstances, should you have rewarded him by giving him your 2 challahs?" And Reb Zelig said to his children, "You need to understand why he slapped me. Because this man is very bitter. He works so hard. He only earns pennies. And each week he comes home with 2 challahs that I give to him. It is the only enjoyment of Shabbos that he has. It is the only way that his Shabbos table has even a bit of joy and relaxation and pleasure. Without those challahs, his Shabbos would be almost like Tisha B'av, God forbid." And because of the bitterness and disappointment that he carries with him, he slapped me. And so Reb Zelig said to his children, "I don't need the 2 challahs for myself. I have some matzah left over from Pesach. I can use that to make hamotzi. But he really needs it." That's what he told his children. But that's not the story I want to share. Because later, Reb Zelig went into his room, and his children could hear him speaking to himself, crying to himself, "Zelig, Zelig, why do you need to get 2 slaps to understand that you should give away your own challahs to someone else in greater need? Why did you have to wait until you had 2 slaps?" As we approach Tisha B'av, certainly a terrible slap from heaven. And as our sages tell us, because of sinas chinam, needless hatred of one another, we have to take the tikkun, the fixing of that, which is ahavas chinam, excessive empathy, needless love. But the question is, why do we need to get so many slaps from God? Why do we need to get so much of this? To understand that we need to love each other, we need to help each other, and even to give away what is ours to others who need it more. That's what we need to do to transform these 3 weeks of mourning into 3 weeks of joy and celebration. And hopefully, by hearing this story, we will learn to act this way, without the patch, without the slap, without the reminder, just because we have absorbed that this is the right way for us to be. I want to share one last piece. This is, in my opinion, the deepest lesson of what it is that we need to accomplish during these 3 weeks, and it is the most difficult lesson. The mourning that we will start to practice today leading to Tisha B'av, the tears, the introspection, are designed to lead us to fixing our own internal deficiencies, which, as I mentioned before, our sages have identified as sinas chinam, baseless hatred, needless hatred, and the most practical, constructive step that we can take. And this, as I mentioned, should be our major effort now, is to practice the antidote. Ahavas chinam, needless love, baseless love for each other. This was famously suggested by Rabbi Avram Kook, first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel. But the thing about Rav Kook is that he did not only suggest it, he lived it. Listen to this story. Rav Kook was an outstanding genius and Torah leader, but he was at the same time a controversial figure. And there were others, especially in Jerusalem at the time, in the 20s and 30s, who took issue with Rav Kook and some of his views. Rav Kook was once giving a major public address, and one of these zealots started yelling at him and cursing him during his speech. Rav Kook was not fazed, but it was a terrible embarrassment. It was a terrible, terrible thing to happen, that such a Torah giant is speaking and we're not treating him with respect. Later that year, Pesach came. And Rav Kook had the practice that before Pesach he would distribute ma'os chitim, which is tzedakah that is raised to give to people who are in need, to make sure that they have the wherewithal to observe Passover properly, to buy wine, to buy matzah. And so Rav Kook had a list of the people that he wanted his secretary to deliver these funds to. And he gives the list to his secretary. And the secretary sees on this list is this man who had so wrongly embarrassed Rav Kook during a public lecture earlier in the year. And the secretary says to Rav Kook, I am not going to deliver to this person. He treated you with such disrespect. How in the world can you give him tzedakah? And Rav Kook said to him, If you do not deliver the money to him, I will deliver the money to him. Secretary said, but please explain to me, how could you do such a thing? And Rav Kook explained as follows. He said the famous concept that he repeated over and over, our sages tell us the temple was destroyed because of sinas chinam, needless hatred, and it will be rebuilt with ahavas chinam, needless love, unjustified love of one Jew for another. Now, what does ahavas chinam mean? It means that you like the person for no reason, just like sinas chinam means you hate the person for no reason. But Rav Kook said that's not accurate. That's not precise. Because when one Jew loves another for no reason, that's not ahavas chinam. That's a mitzvah. There's a mitzvah in the Torah, we quoted it before. Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. You should love your fellow as you love yourself. That refers to every single person. Even if you don't have any special reason for loving them, you are required to loving them. So the Torah itself requires love for every single other Jew, whether I know them or not. That's needless love. If that is a mitzvah, ahavas chinam must be something more than that. What is ahavas chinam? Rav Kook explained, ahavas chinam is when a person insults you, when a person embarrasses you, when you have every justification in the world to not love that person because of how he or she acted to you, and still, nevertheless, you show that person love and compassion, and you give that person tzedakah when that person is in need, that, and only that, is ahavas chinam. And that is what we need to do, and it is hard. But that is what is demanded of us, especially now. So finally, I want to share a stunning, dramatic, extreme demonstration of this. An event that occurred in modern Israeli history. Perhaps you're familiar with it. This is a story that is tragic, difficult, and murky. There is more than one side to the story I'm going to tell you, and I am not attempting to tell the entire historical truth of this story, but I want to utilize one perspective of this story to make a point. And I present this as a cautionary tale relating to today's controversies in Israel, which, as I mentioned, have the real potential to descend, God forbid, into catastrophe. I wish that every Jewish protester in Israel today, on all sides of the debate over judicial reform, yelling and screaming and insulting and dehumanizing the other, accusing the other of the worst motives, I wish that every single one of us doing this would take 1 hour to listen carefully to this story and to consider and to absorb the story I want to tell you now. In establishing the State of Israel, there were two main Jewish military forces with very different tactics. There was the Haganah, led by, among others, David Ben-Gurion, and there was the Irgun, led by, among others, Menachem Begin. It is not an exaggeration to say that they fought against each other at times as bitterly as they both fought against the British. It's not an exaggeration. On June 11th, 1948, just weeks after the establishment of the State of Israel, the Irgun, led by Begin, filled a cargo ship called the Altalena with weapons and ammunition. Now, the weapons and ammunition were desperately needed to help supply the newly created Israel Defense Force and to defend the newly established and embattled State of Israel. But here's where it gets complicated. Ben-Gurion feared that the weapons would be used by the Irgun against the IDF and would amount to a coup against the newly established provisional government. Begin insisted that there was an understanding that he had reached with Ben-Gurion, that this was to assist the IDF, and everything was well known and agreed to in advance. This point is hotly debated until today, and it is not my purpose to explore it now. What is not in dispute is on that fateful night of June 20th, 1948, with the Altalena ship run aground just meters off the Tel Aviv beach, with hundreds of soldiers and bystanders watching on the shore, Ben-Gurion gave the order to the commander on the scene, Yitzhak Rabin, to open fire on the ship. Yehuda Avner, in his wonderful book, The Prime Ministers, describes what happened next. Eyewitnesses describe Menachem Begin standing on the burning deck like some figure in a parable, black from the acrid smoke, flinging up his arms and yelling frantically to his men, "Don't shoot back! Don't open fire! No civil war! Milchamat achim le'olam lo." A war against brothers? Never. Even when it's your brothers who are shooting at you. 16 men aboard that ship were killed. Begin later said, "I could smell the stench of civil war. It was madness. It was tearing Jews apart." And again, consider the parallel to what's happening today. And Begin said, "So I told our men to go quietly, not to resist. It was extremely hard to order our men not to retaliate, with bullets and missiles shooting toward them, but I had to do it. I had to do it, ki Yehudim anachnu, because we are Jews." 16 men on the ship were killed. And not one of them, not one of the men on the ship broke his solemn oath not to retaliate. From the depths of Jewish history came the order not to fight back, and it was obeyed to the very last man. Later that night, Begin said these words, which are as relevant and potent today as when he spoke them that night, and I share them with you now as the deepest message that we need to hear today. And I am hoping that extremists on both sides in Israel today are listening. He said, "Whatever our differences, however strongly held are our differing convictions, however raucous the debate, these shall be expressed only through the civil avenues of legitimate dissent, because only then will we weather every storm, overcome every hurdle, and withstand every test, and we shall grow with God's help from strength to strength." That is Ahavas Chinam. Hopefully we will never face such a test, though we may be coming close, perilously close in Israel today. But in our own individual lives, we need to find ways, large and small, dramatic and pedestrian, to exemplify the same attitude. Avas chinam, to show love even when its opposite is legitimate. This is our task starting today. The purpose for which we experience these next 3 weeks. To myself and to every one of us and to everyone in Israel who is certain that only their path will save Israel and the other path will destroy it. Let's recall Yossi Klein Halevi. Enough mourning for the sake of mourning. Let us turn these 3 weeks into a time of Jewish healing. We need it today more than ever before. My friends, I wish you a good evening, an easy end to the fast, an inspiring and uplifting 3 weeks leading to Tisha B'av. And I look forward to seeing you all soon in person.